Hi, my name is Abigail Hammond. I'm an author and a reader, and I love to talk about books a lot, so that's what I do on this channel. Last night, I just finished this book called The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham, and I really was excited to talk about this one because it's one that I stumbled across that I'd never heard of, I didn't know much about, but I actually heard the first few lines in a video where somebody was just talking about classic books, and they read the first few lines of a few different books, and the opening of this really grabbed my attention. I thought, I need to read that. So The Painted Veil was published in 1933, I believe, if I'm not getting that wrong, and it's been adapted into a movie. I think it might have been adapted into 2 movies. I have not seen them. I'm going to watch the newer one soon. I'm really excited to watch it, but I heard it takes some significant liberties with the story. That still excellent movie and keeps to the story pretty well, but makes some big changes that would affect the story a lot. So I'm excited to watch it, but I definitely wanted to read the book first, and I'm so glad I did. So just a heads up for this one, I am going to talk about spoilers, but that'll be later on in the video. So before I get into spoilers, I'll make sure to say, hey, at this point the spoilers are going to start, so you might want to click off if you're interested. But for the beginning, I'll give you some details and some thoughts on the book to see if you are interested in reading it, because I definitely think this one is worth a shot. So first of all, this was my first book by Somerset Maugham, and I had never experienced his writing before, never read any of his books, but his writing style is excellent. I was really impressed by how, not simple, but the language he used really was sort of simple compared to maybe some older classics from like the 19th century. But the way he writes is still very beautiful. He takes these simple words and phrases and sort of shorter sentences and is able to make the language so beautiful, and the way he communicates things is gorgeous. Some of the descriptions of different places, because this takes place in China, partially in England just for a tiny bit, and then mostly in China. The descriptions of the locations are absolutely gorgeous and just sort of almost like feels like a fantasy sometimes when he's describing it. The descriptions of the locations are gorgeous, and just his way to communicate the characters' feelings and emotions, even in such, like I said, such simple sentences or such simple structures, was really beautiful. It made it such an enjoyable read, but also a total breeze to read through. I think I read it in 2 sittings, mostly because I couldn't put it down. The story is really good. So the basic premise of the story is that we have the main character named Kitty Fane, and she is sort of this British socialite. She was raised by a very domineering mother, and her mom has these designs on, she wants her daughter to marry well, to marry wealthy and rich, and she doesn't really have any other desires for Kitty other than you need to marry really well. And Kitty is raised in a family where there's really not much love. Her relationship with her mother isn't great because her mother sort of sees her as someone to reach a goal she has. Her sister and her are not close because her sister actually envies Kitty a lot because Kitty's sister is not treated well because she's not as pretty or promising as Kitty. And Kitty's father is very much just trampled on and railroaded by Kitty's mother at all turns. So her father really has no relationship with the girls because they treat him with as much disrespect as their mother treats him. So Kitty is raised in this very loveless household. She is very popular in society. She's very much a flirt, very coquettish and all those things because that's just how she was raised to be. What she was taught was good, and she was taught she needs to catch a rich, wealthy, handsome husband and be set up for life. And so that's how she approaches things. But because she keeps turning men down, by the time she's 25, she still has she has no husband, no prospects really. That's starting to dry out because there's been so many boys that have proposed and she's turned them down. And soon enough, her sister is getting married at 18, the first proposal that comes her way. And so Kitty starts panicking. She thinks, oh my gosh, I have to get married. My sister cannot get married before me. How embarrassing is that? And she wants to get out of her home because she knows her mom is sick of her and all these different things. So Kitty ends up accepting the proposal of a man named Walter Fane. Now, Walter is someone she doesn't love. She's not attracted to him. She doesn't really have any strong attachment to him, but he's someone that's been pursuing her, and seems decent enough. So she basically, and he's moving away to China because he's a bacteriologist, so he's a doctor of sorts, and that's where he works in China. So he proposes and says, basically, we'd have to get married right away because I have to go back to China. So it's up to you. I know that you don't love me, whatever. Let's get married. So Kitty is sort of desperate at this point, so she accepts, and she moves with him to China. And all this, by the way, is you can find in the descriptions of the book. I'm not spoiling anything. So Kitty and him move back to China, Kitty and Walter, and they're married for 2 years. Their relationship never really gets any deeper, never really grows much. She still doesn't love him. He's obviously absolutely in love with her, but he's very cold and reserved. He doesn't really share his feelings or thoughts. He's not very open. So there's just sort of this barrier where Kitty is still in a situation where she doesn't understand love and is not feeling love, even though she knows that Walter loves her very much. It's in a way that she doesn't really, it's not exactly the right kind of love. It's more of a selfish kind where he just wanted her so much. He wanted to marry her so that he could have her, and then now he's doing everything in his power to make her happy, even though he knows she doesn't love him. So, unfortunately, Kitty meets this very well-to-do, high society man that's also in China, that is also from England, and she and this man, Charlie, end up having an affair. And at first, it seems like nobody's going to find out, and she's happy. Kitty thinks that for the first time she has discovered what real love is, what true love is, and she thinks that she is experiencing love as it should be. Soon enough, Walter finds out about their affair, and he is not happy, but he handles it in kind of an odd way, where he sort of shuts down, very cold about it, and doesn't really respond the way she thinks. It frightens Kitty because she doesn't understand what he's thinking, why he's not really reacting. And one day he tells her, hey, there's been a cholera outbreak in this remote city in China that's sort of like, it's a trip away from it, like a week's trip away from them. I can't remember the details of how far, but he says, because I'm a bacteriologist, I'm going to go, and you're going to come with me because you're my wife. And Kitty's like, are you kidding me? Like, we'll both die. You could die, and I could die. That's no place for a woman to go. And Walter doesn't say anything, and she realizes, oh, he wants me to come with him so that I'll die because he's angry. And it's crazy. And so I'm not going to share anything else from there because, again, that's where the blurb, if you look up online, sort of ends off. But that's the premise for this book, and it's insane to me that, like, it's the most intriguing premise, and I was really interested because you have all these interesting character dynamics, and you have Kitty she's been raised a certain way her whole life, and all these things have been taught to her, and she's sort of this vain, very selfish sort of girl. And on one hand, that's her own fault, but on the other, it's also the way she was raised and the way she was taught and the family she was brought up in. So you have this crazy sort of climax where you realize this whole story is going to be, Kitty is going to have to go into this dangerous situation with a man she still doesn't love, who now it seems wants her dead. And she goes through this insane transformation. I keep using insane. It's just such a good book. She goes through this struggle and this transformation throughout the course of the book where she's meeting different people. She's faced with death. She's faced with people who are completely destitute, people who are driven by goodness and by compassion and helping others. And she enters into this society unlike any she's ever been in before. And she's forced to stop thinking about herself and her own heartbreak and her own struggles. But even so, she's still thinking about all those things even as she's there. It's a very interesting book. And as I said, the writing is beautiful in it. The descriptions are gorgeous. The way that he writes the characters' thoughts, their action, just everything about it. I loved the writing style, and I think because it's like I said, it's not that it's super simple, but it's that he's so concise with his words, and when he does have descriptions, the wordiness is appreciated because they're so well done. So I definitely recommend this book if it sounds interesting to you. It is very much worth reading, and I would read this before watching the movie because from what I saw, the movie does change the story quite a bit, and I think it's best to read the book first. Now, this is the part where I'm going to be getting into spoilers, but there is one thing I wanted to say before getting into spoilers. This book, just as a little warning ahead of time, it was written in early 1900s, or 1933 it was published, obviously. There are some unfortunate racial slurs in it that I definitely was surprised by, but unfortunately that was how they wrote books at the time, and just giving you a heads up that that's in there. I think the takeaway I had with those slurs, though, is it definitely seemed like that the author was using them to demonstrate Kitty's poor character and poor perception of the world and sort of her vanity, as opposed to other characters who never viewed people through those lenses. And if you read the book, I think what I just said will make more sense. I don't want to spoil anything, but I think you'll understand that while it wasn't a great choice to use those words, it was also demonstrating just how far Kitty had to come in her perceptions of the world around her, perceptions of other people, and how much she needed to grow and learn. All right, so all that aside, now we're going to get into spoiler territory and discuss the book. Okay, so picking up where my description left off, so after Kitty and Walter go to this city where there is cholera, they don't see much of each other. I mean, they see each other in the morning and the night, but they're very much separate. Walter is still coldly cordial to Kitty, but there's no relationship there anymore. So Kitty is left pretty much on her own in this city where thousands of people are dying, where there's all this it's terrible. It's scary, it's terrible. She's terrified, thinks she's going to die. But at the same time, Kitty thinks, well, I have a broken heart. I'll never get to be with the man that I love again. So who cares if I die, basically, is how she approaches it. And when she's first going, she definitely has a bad attitude about it, a bad perspective. But also you have to remember that the background Kitty came from is heartbreaking in and of itself. And so while, yes, we know that what she did was very wrong, there's also needs to be an understanding of her own perspective and her own wounds and the things she's coming from. And so they arrive, and Kitty soon makes friends with one of the other men there. I can't remember. I think he was some sort of ambassador or something. I can't remember. But he's also there from England. His name is Waddington, and he and Kitty become good friends. He is sort of jovial. He drinks a lot. I mean, what do you expect somebody to do when they live in a place where everybody's dying left and right? But he makes fast friends with Kitty, and through him, she learns a lot about the location, what's going on, and finds out that there's a group of nuns there who have a chapel where they take in all the orphaned children, because at this time, girls were, especially because of the cholera, baby girls born in this location were basically chucked aside and unwanted and left to die because it was just a burden on the family and they didn't want little girls. The nuns have this chapel in the city, and they are not only taking care of the sick and trying to help them to the best of their ability, they are also taking in all the orphans and all the little girls that are being thrown out. And so Kitty one day goes to visit the chapel, and she meets the nuns, and she decides she wants to help. She wants to lend a hand, because at this point Kitty's been starting to have a transformation, and not only that, but she's learning more about her own perspectives and where she was wrong and her own failings. And so she chooses to go and help, and the more time she spends there, the more she begins to question and sort of do this work in her own soul of wondering. The more she begins to question her own views and her own beliefs and her own actions, and realizing what she did was wrong. And you see this incredible transformation in Kitty over time. But what you really see, what I found really interesting about the book, is Kitty is struggling through this whole book, through her own mistakes, through her own actions, through her own thoughts. And as you're watching this struggle, it's very visceral. I almost feel as though the author himself, I looked him up, the author himself was a self-proclaimed agnostic. And it felt as though this novel was very Christian, and I'll get more into that as I continue on. But the interesting part to me was when I finished it, I almost had a hard time deciphering my own thoughts and feelings about this book and deciphering what the message was. But the more I thought about it, and I started talking to my husband about it and verbally processing, but the more I thought about it, the more it seems to me almost like the author was writing out his own struggles, his own questions, and his own grappling with these questions and with belief and with the purpose and meaning of life and with death and with all these things through this book. That's what it felt like to me. It felt like he was using these characters in this story to grapple with his own questions and struggles. And that's one of the interesting things about the book is Kitty is going through these struggles and questions and making mistakes and then also doing good things throughout the entirety of the book. And she sort of goes back and forth in her thoughts. She's like, she learns something and then maybe she makes another mistake and she thinks, oh my gosh, like I was wrong. And so you see this struggle, and it is not until the very end, the last 3 paragraphs of the book, that you really see a marked, like a very distinct change or turning point for Kitty. So this book is interesting because rather than seeing a turning point maybe at the 2/3 mark and you see Kitty's changed and all this good stuff starts happening, it really is a struggle for Kitty throughout the whole book. And it isn't until that last chapter, like I said, where you see a turning point. And you're not seeing the resolution, you're not really seeing this huge like moment of happiness and where everything is right again. You just see the turning point. You see the beginning of what will be Kitty's new path and her new perspective. You're not seeing the actual result of that. And that made it really interesting to me, and also is what made it feel so difficult to me, because you're basically reading the story of, rather than a very distinct, like, okay, this character goes from point A to point B to point C, happily ever after, you're seeing this character goes from A and is making her way to C, but doesn't quite get there, but we see her finding her way there. And that's why I think this could possibly be the author's own exploration of his own struggles and questions, because it seems like he's leaving it sort of unanswered, but still on a more hopeful note at the end, and with hopes of finding. Kitty's last final things she says is that she hopes to find the way, and I want to read that part to sort of demonstrate that. And so this is what Kitty says at the end. She says, "I have hope and courage. The past is finished. Let the dead bury their dead. It's all uncertain, life and whatever is to come to me. But I enter upon it with a light and buoyant heart. It's all confused, but vaguely I discern a pattern, and I see before me an inexhaustible richness, the mercy and the strangeness of everything, compassion and charity, the way and the wayfarer, and perhaps in the end, God." And that's how the book ends. And like I said, it leaves you sort of on this note where it's not that it's all happy for Kitty, and it's not this perfectly done ending that's tied with a bow. But you've seen her struggle, and this sort of revelation or this decision she comes to slowly over the course of all this time and all these mistakes leaves you really thinking and considering things about your own life, but also about her. And I think it leaves questions about the story and makes you go back and think over everything. It's interesting because earlier in the story, that was another thing that she says, is that specifically that she knows she's missing something. She knows there's something she's missing that other people know about, and specifically being around the nuns is what makes her begin to question this. And she doesn't know what it is. And to one of the characters she says, "I'm looking for something and I don't quite know what it is, but I know that it's very important for me to know it. And if I did, it would make all the difference." And so when you get to the end and you see that Kitty still doesn't have the answer, but she has hope of finding the answer. And so the character arc in this isn't, I would say it's not your standard character arc. It's not your standard story. There's a lot of heartbreak, a lot of things that happen that you wouldn't think would happen. But the message and the grappling with these big questions and with life and with mistakes and struggle and suffering and death are handled so well. And I love when a book leaves things more open-ended, because I think that makes you think. It leaves it up for your own interpretation, and it's not giving you a clear answer, which I love. But to continue with the story, so Kitty begins helping with the nuns, and she begins having all these questions. She begins really struggling through these things, and soon enough she finds out she's actually pregnant. And she has no idea and no way of knowing until the baby is born and she can see who it looks like, if it's going to be a baby of the man she had an affair with or her husband's baby. And so when Walter, her husband, finds out, he asks her, is it mine? And she has to be honest and say, "I don't know." And it's this weird turning point where she realizes if she had lied and said yes, then there would have been a reconciliation for them. But she felt she couldn't lie to him. She couldn't do it. And so she told him the truth. And Walter is obviously heartbroken by this, by her not knowing. And she asks, what are we going to do in the future if we get out of this? The cholera seems to be dying down. Are we going to continue living together? Like, what are we going to do? She says, "I don't even care anymore. If you want to divorce me, I don't care. I'm going to figure life out. What do you want to do?" Basically, she's just sort of still heartbroken, is trying to figure things out. And he says, he doesn't even give a straight answer. He just says not to worry about it. But she can tell that in his mind, he's still thinking they're going to die, or that he wants to die, either one. You see this part of Walter in this book where you realize, while he is a good man, he was honorable, he worked hard, he loved Kitty, there were parts of him that were twisted and that were not reflective of the good man he is and should be. And he himself sort of admits this, because soon after, Walter gets cholera and he dies. And you find out that he was actually experimenting on himself with cholera. And it sort of leaves it again open to question, was he doing these experiments because he wanted to find a cure and he just was a self-sacrificial good man? Or was he doing these experiments because he died of a broken heart and he had a broken heart and he wanted to die? Because later in another conversation, Kitty brings up that he had died of a broken heart. And so her definitive statement of that, of knowing that it was her fault, really bothers her. And the last thing she says to him after he dies, when she's looking at the body, is, "I'm sorry I gave you so much trouble." And she wants him, when she sees him on his deathbed and he's so close, he's still living but sort of delirious, she apologizes and asks for forgiveness. And she wants his forgiveness, not for herself, she thinks, but so that he can be at peace. She doesn't want him to be troubled anymore. But the last thing he says to her is a phrase, and he says, "It was the dog that died." And this phrase is from a poem called Goldsmith's Elegy of a Mad Dog, or something, I think. It was along those lines. And in this poem, it tells the story of a good man who goes walking through town every day, and he befriends this stray dog. Everybody loves this guy. He's a great guy. He befriends this stray dog. They become friends. But then it says there's some sort of issue that makes the dog angry and is a slight to his pride. So the dog then bites the good man. And everybody thinks the good man is going to die because of this dog bite, because the dog is a stray, probably has rabies, whatever. At the end of the poem, you find out that actually the dog dies. And the last line of the poem is, "It was the dog that died. The dog that bit the good man died. And the fact that Walter ends, his last words to her are, "It was the dog that died," after she asks for forgiveness, obviously signifies that Walter is the mad dog in this situation. He is the one who did wrong by bringing her, he knows he did wrong by bringing her in hoping she would die. He's basically receiving, I guess, a punishment, a consequence of his own pride and his own desire for vengeance. The author, again, doesn't really explain the poem. You have to look up the poem on your own. He doesn't go into this. He doesn't go into what Walter meant by that. So much of this is left up to your own interpretation and to your own sort of thinking through what he might mean. And that part really was interesting to me because obviously I think it's clear what Walter meant about himself, but then also the fact that the man that the dog bites in the poem is such a good man that everybody loved is interesting when you're thinking of Kitty, because obviously Kitty made a grave mistake. She had an affair when she was married, and that's not something good. It's almost as if her husband was telling her she was still more innocent in this situation than he was because he brought her here with murder in his heart. And it's just an interesting thing to think about. I don't really have any specific thoughts on that, but it's one of the things that has made me think the most and really consider it. And yeah, I think there's a lot to think about there that I still need to think about, but I do think about that. And if you have interesting thoughts on that section of the book, I'd love to hear them in the comments, because again, that part's really been getting stuck in my head. So Walter dies, and Kitty is sort of, again, it throws her into that deep where she's really thinking about things and wondering. She asks her friend Waddington if he thinks souls exist, if there's life after death, and is having these deep conversations. And he is somebody who's more of a skeptic. I believe he believes in Taoism because he has a wife. She's not really his wife, but she's his wife who believes in that. It's an interesting section because Kitty doesn't necessarily agree with him, doesn't necessarily believe what he says, but she listens and she's seeking for something, and she cannot find what it is she's looking for. And again, it's the thing where she says she thinks the nuns have whatever it is, but she can't quite grasp it. So after this, the nuns tell her she needs to go home, that she can't stay here anymore because there's cholera, there's not enough doctors or trained professionals to be able to help a woman who's pregnant and going to be going into labor. Kitty doesn't want to leave. She tells the nuns, "I have no one in the world who loves me. No one cares a row of pins if I live or die." And she's so distraught at being forced to leave because these nuns are the only people she's found that she feels she has a place with, where she's useful and where she's cared for. But they tell her she has to go. And so they send her home. And again, she's frustrated and distraught, and she's still thinking, but she thinks, well, if I'm going home, she has to stop in the Chinese city Qingyan where she was living with Walter. She has to stop there, sell their old house, get rid of all their belongings, and then move back to Britain with her family. And she's dreading going back to her mother and father because she knows they don't want her. She's just a nuisance, but she has no other options. So Kitty arrives at Qingyan, where she and Walter had been living before, and when she arrives, to her very great dismay and surprise, the wife of Charlie's wife, the man she'd been having an affair with, Charlie, his wife, Dorothy, shows up at the dock to pick her up. Dorothy knew nothing about their affair, obviously. Kitty is shocked, can't believe it, but Dorothy is there because Waddington had sent a letter ahead that Kitty's husband had died, and that she was pregnant, and that she was coming back because Waddington didn't want her to be alone. Dorothy insists, she's so sorry for Kitty. Dorothy feels so bad. She just feels terrible. She thinks Kitty's a hero for having gone to this place with cholera with her husband, all these things. And Kitty in her heart is thinking, if only you knew how awful I am, or what a terrible person I am, you would never say any of these things about me. But Dorothy keeps insisting that Kitty stay with them while she's in Qingyan. And Kitty's like, no, I can't. I was going to get a hotel. I don't want to impose on you. I don't really want to be around strangers right now. But Dorothy keeps pressing. So Kitty, not wanting to be rude, finally just gives in. And the first few days it seems fine. She avoids Charlie, he avoids her, but then one day Charlie's wife is gone. And Charlie approaches her and she basically tells him off, says how much she despises him, how much she doesn't want anything to do with him, how mad she is at him, how she would give anything to have Walter back, and that Walter's worth 10 of Charlie. And unfortunately, not entirely due to Kitty's fault, Charlie he doesn't force himself on her, but he pushes her much more than is proper and than he should have, and really takes advantage of her when she's in a very emotional state. And they end up being together one more time. And Kitty, afterwards, she absolutely hates herself. And she's sitting there and she thinks, I thought I was changed. I thought I was different. I cannot believe that I have just fallen right back into this when I thought I was going to be such a better person now. And you have this moment where she's just so distraught and hates herself for what she's done. And she decides immediately, I'm leaving tomorrow. I am not going to stay another day here. I need to go home to my family in Britain. That is the only place I am going to be able to move forward from this and try to fix my life, basically. She packs up and she leaves. She tells Charlie off one more time because he tries to stop her, and she goes. Before I continue on, the thing that really struck me about this part is so many times we see these stories where characters sort of have their big moment of change and then they don't make another mistake. They don't fall back into the same mistake as before. But I think it's a much more realistic depiction to show a person who made mistakes. She thought she'd improved. She thought she'd gotten better. She thought she'd figured things out and was just a better person, a stronger person. And she fell into the same mistake again, even though she didn't want to and even though she immediately regretted it. Because that's so often how we as humans are. That's one of the things that I think is reminiscent of sort of the Christian faith, is that we see even in one of Paul's epistles, I can't believe I'm blanking on which book of the Bible this is right now, but he talks about how the things he doesn't want to do, he still does. And it's only by God's grace that we're able to be forgiven and we're able to be transformed and changed and made able to resist the temptation, but we still make mistakes. And I think it's such a realistic depiction with Kitty falling into the same mistake again because she thought on her own she had changed and she could do better and she was stronger. And yet we still are imperfect and make mistakes, and she's beating herself up and she can't believe that. So she leaves, she goes back home, and she finds out her mother has just died. And it's only her father left. Her sister's married and moved out. It's only her father left. And remember, her father did not have a good relationship with her. He did not have a good relationship with any of the girls in his family because they all treated him like a doormat. They treated him terribly, basically as the one paying for their lifestyle, and that's all that they thought of him as. And Kitty now is so changed. She's learned so much. She sees the difference she's often thinking about the difference between the place she was living where there was cholera and dead people in the streets and there was no comforts, there was nothing there. And then she sees the sort of opulence, relative opulence that she lived in, and that where she lived were like, for instance, Dorothy and Charlie's house, and then even in Britain, the relative opulence she was living in. She sees just all these differences that she would never have known before. Almost like, as the title, like a veil has been lifted and she understands a little bit better life, and she's seeing through a different perspective rather than the lenses she saw through before, which she was raised to see through, the things she was raised to believe and the things she was taught about the world around her. And the limited perspective she'd had is changed. And she notices the pain her father had gone through his whole life, and just this being trodden on and looked down upon. And she notices things like, for instance, she has dinner with him, and after dinner he goes to smoke a pipe, but he immediately puts the pipe away because he says, oh, my wife never liked when I smoked. She didn't like the smell. And Kitty tells him, no, like if you want to smoke, go ahead. She says, I like the smell. And it's like a relief to him. And her heart sort of breaks in this moment for her father, who she sees all this pain he's gone through, trying to love and take care of these women who didn't return that love, didn't respect him or anything. And soon enough, Kitty, who still, again, she has nowhere to go, nothing to do except to go to her father. He says to her, I've been offered this job, it's in the Bahamas, so I'm going to have to move away, but I will let you take whatever furniture from this house you want, and I'll pay for you to have a flat somewhere in the city if you want. Like, I'm not going to just leave you high and dry. And Kitty is nervous to ask, but she asks if she can go with him because she doesn't want to be alone. She wants family. She wants someone that loves her. She wants to experience love, real love, from someone for once in her life because she realized she hasn't had that love. And she's desperate for her dad to love her. And he, when she asks to go with him, he's visibly disappointed. And she knows it's because of how she's treated him her whole life, how he's been treated by her mom and her sister his whole life. And she knows he thought he was finally getting to break away, a clean break where he could actually live his life in peace and be happy and have some freedom to do what he wanted to do and not be constantly nitpicked and nagged and just told how awful he was. And so Kitty is sad that that's the reaction of her dad, but she understands and she says, he says yes, of course. He just immediately says yes, that's fine, because he's just used to letting them do whatever. But she says, no, I don't want to go unless you're all right with me going. Like, if I want you to be free to do what you want to do, you deserve that much. And her dad's like, no, of course you can come with me. I'm your father. And one of the lines he says really stuck out to me, and one of the things that to me also seems very Christian. He says, she promises him, I promise I won't bother you. I won't cause you any trouble. I just want to stay with somebody who I know may love me at some point in the future. And he says, under the circumstances, it was evident that the only place for you to come to was your father's house. And that was like, wow, because obviously, okay, I'll get more to that later, but that line really got me. But so Kitty's talking to him, and finally she just tells him that. She says, I want you to be happy. Like, I'm not trying to take away your freedoms. And she explains, I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I've been terrible. I've lived my whole life. I've done terrible things. I've made terrible mistakes. I looked at the world incorrectly, and I want to make that better. And I want a chance to make you love me as my father. Like, I want you to love me as your daughter, and I want to be able to show you love as my father. And she wants that, to build that relationship between her and her father that she's never had, a relationship she's never had with anyone, of truly loving and caring and in a non-selfish way for each other. And her dad starts crying, and he smiles, and he's like happy about it because it touches him. But it's just this moment where you see for the first time this true turning point, this true reconciliation in Kitty. But what's interesting to me is this turning point in her life comes when she reconciles with her father, when she goes to her father's house and she reconciles with her father. And it's then that she begins to see a way forward, and she begins to see hope, and she begins to understand love and to desire true love and those things. And that's what struck me as being so strangely, in a way, Christian about this, even though the author is himself a self-proclaimed, or was a self-proclaimed agnostic. And that's why I think this whole book is him struggling through these questions in his own way, because you see so many things that I think can point to what I believe is the answer to these questions, the answer to these struggles. And Kitty herself was looking for that answer, and the author was looking for that answer. And I believe that the answer is clear through this book. The book points to the answer very clearly. And even though we don't see Kitty quite get there, we see all the signs and all the struggle and all the thoughts and all the things pointing to that hope. And the last word of the book is "and God," and she's talking about how she might eventually find God, and that she has hope for the future now instead of despair, and she's ready to move forward in life now. And it's such a I loved this book. I did not expect this book to be so thought-provoking in this way, and to make you think so deeply. Because it is short, and it's relatively short. It was like 220 pages, I think. And the questions it asks are so poignant, and questions that so many people ask and so many people wonder about. But many times people are afraid to grapple with these questions because they're big questions and they're scary. But I love that this book grappled with them. And like I said, the parallels to me, to Christianity, and what a relationship with Jesus Christ looks like, a relationship with God the Father looks like, was incredible. And like I said, the author wasn't saying that that's the right way. He was leaving it very open-ended. He was illustrating the struggle that people go through with these questions, and Kitty's growth and her own struggles and her own soul searching. But he did it in this gripping way with a story that kept you turning. I could not stop reading it. It was just page after page. The writing style, the actual story, the characters, it all keeps you going. And Kitty goes from somebody who in the beginning, she's never quite very unlikable. I always sort of liked Kitty, but a lot of the things she does make her feel unlikable, or just there are things where you think that's not nice, it's not a good quality, or why would you do that? But you cannot help. You have such a window into her soul and into her thoughts and into her struggles and feelings that you cannot help but feel sorry for her and want her to be able to find that peace. So when she finds that peace at the end, when she discovers that she just wants to be loved and to have a family, and she says she wants to raise a daughter, and she's going to teach her not to live the way she lived, but to live a better way and to live a better life. And it's those things that really hit home, because like I said, even though we're not seeing this happy ending where Kitty's running around with the house and she has a nice husband and she's got all these kids and she's happy now and fulfilled, we're seeing the beginning of her journey on the right path. We're seeing the end of one of her journeys and the beginning of the next, but the next looks much more hopeful than this one. And so all that to say, I definitely recommend The Painted Veil. This was an excellent book, and it really makes you think. Like I said, don't read this just for story's sake. Really read this and think about it. It's so good. And again, it's open-ended. It's one of those books where it leaves you to think about things and determine the answers for yourself. And that's the beautiful thing, because we should be using our brains to think through these things and determine what we believe for ourselves, not just taking what somebody else tells you or taking what you see online or taking just random things to be your own belief. It's important to think independently, to think for yourself through the facts, through the evidence, through different emotions and different problems and see what actually points to the truth, what the evidence points to. And so again, I love this book. I think the author did a fantastic job. The story was great, writing was great, and I'm gonna stop rambling about it now. Definitely go and read this if you haven't, and if you have read it, which you probably have if you're still here, please let me know in the comments what you thought about this book, because I don't think anyone I know has read this book, and I thought it was so good, and I would love to have discussions about it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.